Hello, I'm Cody Weddle from Caracas, and this is From Caracas. Today we're going to be analyzing the recent midterm elections in the United States, and we're joined by Felix Roque. Felix is an international relations and constitutional law expert. Felix, thanks so much for joining us here today.
Hi.
I want to begin, most domestic media in the United States, they have focused on the statewide races where we've seen major Republican victories. Right now, let's review the stats. Right now, it's clear that Republicans have gained at least 7 seats in the U.S. Senate. That's going to bring them to 52. The Republicans also hold the most seats in the U.S. House of Representatives since the 1940s. So the media in the U.S., the domestic media, has characterized this as a Republican takeover, a shift to the right in the U.S., and a repudiation of Obama. Do you agree with that characterization? And what else do you take away from the elections on Tuesday in the U.S.?
Sí, la situación ocurrida en estas elecciones parlamentarias norteamericanas.
What happened on these midterm elections allows us to analyze the issue from a general viewpoint. You could ask who won and who lost these elections, and people could simply say President Obama lost and the Republicans won. Nonetheless, a more complex analysis may offer us a different response. Maybe President Obama did not lose these elections, nor did the Republicans win. Maybe it was the defeat of a political project, one that President Obama first proposed when he took office in 2009. But North Americans have realized that he did not meet his commitments related to both domestic and foreign affairs. To sum up, Obama first won the elections promising a progressive program for the immigrants that had not been carried out. He promised a social security program and to reduce living costs, which again created expectation we have not been met, as well as a program aiming to close centers of detention and torture, such as Guantanamo, something that has not happened. He also promised the American people to improve security conditions. However, we have witnessed an increase of insecurity in universities and schools, so against this promise has not been fulfilled. With regards to the American foreign policy, the so-called Obama doctrine based on humanitarian war has been used in order to interfere in other countries' domestic affairs, to overthrow legitimate autonomous governments and establish puppet governments. Also, these results show that the North American political system continues with its strategy to win votes by offering products to the electorate. Commodities dictated by the free market, and so the people try and see who gives them more. Another characteristic of this electoral system is the Electoral College, which brings a consequence, among others, high levels of abstention, with 60 to almost 70% of the population not participating in the elections. There are over 300 million North Americans, but only 33% of them voted. So it is only a minority of the population that is choosing their representatives in Congress and the Senate. They distance themselves from the process. They do not feel identified by the system, so much so that there's a problem of legitimacy in the elections. So is it really a legitimate representation? There are important doubts.
And that's what I want to talk about, the system in the U.S. as it's set up now. In 2010, the Supreme Court in FCC versus Citizens United overthrew some electoral reform that had been passed, basically opening the floodgates for money during campaigns. This recent campaign is going to be the most expensive in U.S. history. $4 billion were spent on this in this election cycle. So can we really even call it a democracy with so much money being used to influence how voters vote?
Decíamos que es paradójico cómo el costo elevado de las campañas electorales norteamericanas contrasta con las últimas cifras que hemos leído. 56 millones de norteamericanos padecen de hambre.
There is a paradox between the elevated cost of the North American electoral campaigns and the latest figures that we have seen. 56 million North Americans go hungry. Of these 56 millions, 15 millions are minors. Hundreds of thousands of North Americans sleep in their cars or in shacks because their mortgages on their houses have left them homeless. Meanwhile, the North American industry continues to produce candidates that they can give off the image that they are the country of freedom and democracy.
Con estos dos conceptos, Cory, de democracia y de libertad, los Estados Unidos, desde 1606,
with these two concepts, Cody, of freedom and democracy since 1606, the United States, when the colonizer from England settled in New England, Boston, Massachusetts, etc., they have tricked the world and have presented themselves as the pendulum of humanity, and those chosen by God to save the world.
De ese tiempo hasta acá mucha agua ha corrido y uno ha ido conociendo doctrina tras doctrina, la doctrina Monroe.
Since then, a lot has happened, and one has come to know one doctrine after the other. The Monroe Doctrine, the Truman Doctrine, the Roosevelt Corollary, the Eisenhower Doctrine, the Kennedy one, and the start of the interventionist politics in Latin America. The interventions in Central America, the bombing of Vietnam with Johnson and Nixon, and the doctrine in the name of the so-called national security with the famous attack, or the so-called attack, of the 11th of September on the Twin Towers in New York. All this history simply tells us that the United States have been created and have been maintained to make us believe they are the leaders of democracy. A democracy, as we have explained in your first question, that is founded on an electorate that doesn't participate and on an industry that creates one candidate after another. And that is how the country continues to grow.
Y en una industria que es la que fabrica candidatos tras candidatos. Y así va a seguir siendo en ese país. Y las últimas tendencias orientan hacia que los Estados Unidos cada día van perdiendo liderazgos.
But with these latest trends, we can also see how the United States is starting to lose influence and leadership in the continent and in the world. You can still say the United States is the dominant country, but its hegemony is not as strong as it once was. The rise of China, of Russia, of the BRICS group, and the new poles that have been created in Latin America, such as CELAC, UNASUR, ALBA, and Petrocaribe, are clear examples that show that today the peoples are not willing to be subjected to imperialist whims. And this new integrationist wave that seek out international cooperation, mutual respect, in the non-intervention of domestic matters, in democracy, in peaceful coexistence, today there is a world movement that is fighting to protect the environment, but the United States isolate themselves from these processes every day a bit more.
And let's get to some of the issues that we might see over the next 2 years coming out of the United States that we'll now have to deal with the Democratic President Barack Obama and the Republican-controlled Congress. One of Obama's main promises, campaign promises, since he was first elected in 2008, has always been immigration reform. Since this Republican victory in the Congress, he said he might use his executive powers to pass some type of immigration reform. Do you expect any type of immigration reform to come out of Washington in the next few years?
A Obama le quedan 2 años de su segundo periodo gubernamental. 2 años en política es muy poco tiempo.
Obama has 2 years left in his second term. When it comes to politics, 2 years is nothing, so the outlook is pessimistic. What Obama didn't do in these 6 years, 4 from his first term and 2 from his second term, leads us to say that what he promised to voters, mainly Latinos, particularly Central America immigrants, who many of them live in extremely bad conditions and are undocumented, I think we can say that the promises are not going to be fulfilled.
Una oleada importante de extranjeros que viven allí en condición de inmigrantes, en su gran mayoría ilegales, no van a ser cumplidos. Los inmigrantes siguen siendo maltratados.
These immigrants continue to be abused, humiliated, and persecuted, especially on the Mexican border, which is wrapped in endless crime. Numerous cases of forced disappearances carried out by the North American police forces, along with the drug trafficking gangs that rule in that area.
De suerte tal que estos 2 años de Obama, y lo dijo ayer, dijo Obama después de conocer la total derrota.
Yesterday, after acknowledging his electoral defeat, Obama stated that he intends to rule by decree, and if the majority of the legislative branch backs his proposals, he might put them aside from the Congress to pass them, which is something difficult to understand. He doesn't control the Congress, where his hands are pretty much tied. During the remaining 2-year rule, North Americans can't expect much of him. The immigrant communities, who represent a significant amount of the population, especially in Baja California and other bordering states, will continue to be badly treated. We recognize the Republicans maintain a hardline approach toward immigrants, passing tough federal laws. Some governors, such as the Texas governor, have implemented tough domestic measures directly affecting those workers who go to the U.S. in the pursuit of a better life.
Porque hay que decirlo, el hecho de que los republicanos hayan logrado la mayoría en ambas cámaras, hasta ahora los republicanos han demostrado ser muy duros para con los inmigrantes.
To sum up, Obama's promises will not be fulfilled. That article Nobel Prize winner José Saramago entitled The Black Hope, written in 2009 when Obama won the elections, showed that things have stayed just as they first were, as a hope, and a hope today that has no color. The hope is not even black anymore.
But is it even clear where Obama stands on this issue? Because the deportations under his administration have only gone up. I think 1,000 immigrants a day have been deported under his administration. So do we even know, although we have seen those policies coming out of Republican governors and Republican legislatures, do we even know where Obama stands on immigration reform?
Yo pienso que ni siquiera el propio Obama está seguro de su propia política. Creo que
I believe that even Obama is not sure about this policy. It is the same problem we have had for years, with few exceptions. American presidents almost come out of a laboratory, of the state machinery, and it happens that even themselves lose their own identity. They're not the ones who set the rules. There are other powerful groups deciding the policies, those who work behind the scenes, out of the camera's view. Every day we see more and more immigrants being deported. This is a main policy, and this is not going to change. The Republicans have been very tough, very severe and radical, and in an eventual Republican government, these policies will only be deepened. And I said in my previous answer, I don't think immigrants in the United States have much to hope for, from either Obama or whoever follows.
Okay, so let's talk about foreign policy a little bit. One of your themes, I'm sure you can elaborate for us. So while we see the elections Tuesday, the Republicans have come into power in the legislative branch. In Latin America, in South America, Dilma Rousseff has been reelected in Brazil, progressive leftist candidate. In Bolivia, Evo Morales has been reelected. And it's also looking like in Uruguay, Tabaré Vázquez of the Broad Front Party will likely also be elected. How do you see those two forces interacting in the coming years under the new government in the United States?
No, yo creo que hay que recordar hoy más que nunca al poeta.
Today, we have to bear in mind poet Mario Benedetti's thoughts, who wrote, "The South also exists. As the far right gains ground in all sectors in the U.S., we have a different situation in the entire Latin America. From Rio Grande to Patagonia, the situation is entirely different. In El Salvador, for example, a left-leaning government was elected. The same happened in Panama. And in Brazil, as you just said, Dilma Rousseff also won the elections, defeating the right-wing and business-friendly challenger. In Bolivia, the overwhelming victory of Evo Morales shows just how consolidated the Bolivian revolution has become. And in Uruguay, the left will continue to win, I'm sure. In Ecuador, where governs Correa and the Citizens' Revolution, the same is happening. In Argentina, in Venezuela, so almost in the entire Latin American continent, even in Mexico, where even this government is different to past governments. We can see that these waves of progressive and leftist thinking in the Latin American peoples are being consolidated. With this analysis, we have to recognize the huge influence Hugo Chavez had in this. His leadership, his strength, his charisma, and his discourse has been important for all these regional governments. And today, ALBA, for example, which is an expression of sovereignty, is clear proof that the geopolitics in Latin America has changed, on how today we can talk of a multipolar and pluricentric world, on how our countries are no longer the so-called backyard of the United States, as we have been known for centuries. Today we are free countries, independent countries, and this means there is no turning back. Venezuelan democracy is consolidated every day more and more in different social sectors. And so the destiny of our peoples will be that, to continue being free, revolutionary and democratic, with governments that refuse to be humiliated or submitted to empires wherever they come from.
And last question, I wanted to ask you about Cuba. Once again, we've seen the UN vote overwhelmingly to suggest that the U.S. lift its embargo on Cuba. So far, the U.S. hasn't budged. Do you expect to see any changes in the U.S.'s policy towards Cuba in the next 2 years?
The last election that took place in the UN General Assembly with regard to the blockade against Cuba was a clear and overwhelming message that no one now supports the United States in their campaign to block a dignified and free people. And anyway, this policy is unsustainable. The North American people and a good part of the business sector had stated to demand of the government that the blockade come to an end. A blockade that has been going on for more than 50 years. That has caused multi-million-dollar losses for both the Cuban government and the people, and which is a policy that goes against all the humanitarian principles of the UN Carta Magna. This is why we believe the Cuban blockade will be coming shortly to an end.
All right, Felix, thank you so much for that insight. It's very useful for me, and I'm sure for our viewers as well. From Caracas, I'm Cody Weddle.